the panel's title is Chinese Business History, and I do consider myself a Chinese business historian. So delighted to offer some thoughts on the two papers. What ties the two papers together for me is sparks. You may wonder why. I mean, probably easier to comprehend in the case of Ghassan's work, electricity, light bulb, sparks, makes sense. But it actually ties to Billy's work as well, because his emphasis on financial statement analysis has totally rekindled my my passion in my previous life in that particular regard. So allow me to geek out on you just a little bit on that. But before I do that, what I know as financial analysis, financial statement analysis, could be totally anachronistic compared to the situation in 1929. So that's something that I am very mindful of, and I would like to get the entire group to think about it with me together. Let's focus on Billy's important findings first. There are a lot of good concluding statements about the capital structures of the two companies and the different strategies, in particular in terms of liquidity. He has a lot of good ratios on how the two companies were managing different layers of the balance sheet, cash as a percentage of current assets, or cash as a percentage of total assets. Same thing with debt to equity ratio, how much of the companies was financed by debt or bank loans versus equity investments. Now the focus on balance sheet, is a point well taken, reflects a particular way of approaching financial statements, in that these are snapshots of moments in time. How much of this particular asset do you have on December 31st, 1929? So it's a moment in time, taking stock type of motion. And it is very helpful in this regard in our understanding of the investment situation, the investment side of the business. What I thought I'll ask Billy to elaborate a little bit more on is on the operational side of the business. And by that I mean, well, usually in a set of financial statements now, you will have an income statement as well. That will tell you a little bit more about the flow over a particular year. How much revenues did you accrue in a year, and what were the costs associated with that in that particular year? And I think that trying to link those two together could well tell us a little bit more about the way these businesses conducted themselves. Let me give you a couple of examples. So Billy looked at accounts receivables as a percentage of assets. That's very important. How much do your customers owe you at any particular moment in time as a percentage of your total assets? What can be also quite interesting is accounts receivable as a percentage of sales, because it tells you basically the payment terms you extend to your customers. When I sell something, when I sell refrigerator, or actually in the case of Billy's case, books, to a particular vendor, do I offer you a 3-month term that you just don't need to pay me for 90 days? That's something that I think we can think a little bit about as well if we triangulate the information just somewhat differently. Same thing with inventories, which Billy looked at as well. So instead of inventory as a percentage of asset or current assets, maybe we can think of it as inventory as a percentage of cost of goods sold. So as in, how much inventory of books do you carry at any particular moment in time? What's this business strategy in terms of operations of these two companies and how they might have differed? And for that, of course, we need income statements, which may or may not exist in this particular case, and love to learn a little bit more about it. And if they do, there are other types of analysis like margins that we can look at. What are the operating margins of these two cases, and how differently they might have looked. So now let me focus on some of the observations of what we have as well. Sales, upward trend for both of them, but then as we look at the growth rates, these are very volatile operations, at least in the sense of real growth rate. So I'm not sure if it's in terms of the nominal growth rate, if you don't adjust for inflation, whether it was actually not quite as volatile. But if it is volatility introduced because of inflation, I wonder, maybe that's back to the income statement as well, how the two publishers actually could control the cost side of things, whether it was volatile in the same way as sales, so that the margins remained relatively the same. And for the two of them, it could be quite different, as paper costs could well be the same for the both of them, but as you said, labor, they approach it quite differently. One outsourced quite aggressively, the other one not. So I wonder how that might have been reflected in the way inflation might have introduced additional volatility to the business. What else do we have that I find quite intriguing on the balance sheet? The issue of property. I wonder how much of that was, say, real estate, storefronts, buildings, how much of that was equipment. And if we have somewhat of a breakdown of that, it would also be quite interesting to our understanding of the criticality of the different functions of the two presses. I guess I'm pushing on that point a little bit because many of the businesses in Hong Kong that brand themselves as, I don't know, to be in the food and beverage industry, where they derive most of the money is actually the real estate holdings. So I wonder how much of that is hiding behind the labels of both of these as book publishers' presses. Now, let me just touch on one other point, and I'll turn to Ghassan's paper on the issue of goodwill. Now, I am at the risk of being anachronistic here quite a bit because I don't know what exactly the goodwill here refers to. Usually in, no, I'm not an accountant today. My information is, my understanding is more late 20th century, early 21st. Goodwill usually comes from acquisitions. So if you, say if Google were to pay a new startup $10 billion for something, but the net book value of that company is only $1 billion, then you would bring it onto your balance sheet by accruing $9 billion of goodwill. So I wonder how much of that could have been the case here, and I think for that we'll need to understand the events that trigger the registration of goodwill at particular moments in time. Did they buy a certain press with some good titles? And even though that was not quite recorded as net book value on the company that they acquired, they brought it on so that in say the $4 million, much of that was goodwill that reflects the say either the brand of what they acquired or the titles that would continue to generate revenues. So I think that would provide us with a little bit more to chew on in the discussion of goodwill. Now, I keep saying that I run the risk of being anachronistic here. I do want to see if we can all think about the changes in accounting practices over time, or at least at that particular moment in time, 1929, across the two locations, because the differences could be quite revealing, not just of the standards themselves, but also the business focus that these two companies, ostensibly in the same industry, might have placed on their operations and the way they think about their growth. Now, turning to Ghassan's paper, where it's not just this presentation, I totally look forward to what he's going to produce for the larger project. And much of what I say could well be basically foreshadowing some of the things that you're doing already beyond this particular project. And what you're looking at is pioneers in electricity, electrical appliances. It's new technology. And I'm probably conditioned by my own work on aviation. It is a new form of technology. But then the functions that it served, that is replacing something, right? Light bulbs are new. Light is not new. So what exactly are these appliances replacing at, for each of the functions that you're looking at, each of the appliances that you're referring to? And how did the replacement mechanism work? In the case of light bulb, what you referred to, especially in the written article as well, that's a sense of aggregation. If it is a wholesale replacement of lights in the city, the purchasing power, of course, is aggregated in one particular location versus more of an evangelical efforts of having households convert to this new form of light production. So the adoption and the purchasing could be quite interesting. I know you're not interested in understanding electrification as a totally new phenomenon across the board, but I do wonder if we need to at least explore that a little bit. Because even as new forms of technology, electricity was not the only game in town. In certain places, they were replacing gas lights, gas lamps. So if we think of electricity not quite as just electricity in and of itself, but as a form of energy that will allow you to produce certain functions, how should we think about the substitution across these particular platforms? Electricity can give you a lot of things. Gas can too. But then, while you can use gas to heat up water, to produce heat, produce light, you cannot use that. Well, you can use it to drive cars too. But there are certain things that gas will not quite work. I mean, that's why in this day and age. We still have two bills, one from our gas company and the other one from our electricity company. So I wonder if we need to think about that across these platforms, especially at the moment of introduction because they were so new. I also think that we can think of complementarity as well. If we're thinking of electricity as a platform, then it's easier for us to understand how it needs to be wired into homes so that I just don't have lights, I just have the fan. You know, what are basically the killer apps that allow for electricity's popularization at a particular moment in time, and how did it function in the context of the industry dynamics at that time. There's also obviously also the effect of networking, networks, like you said about telephones, right? If I'm the only one with a phone, that doesn't do me any good. If we are all having phones in just one city, then the reach is quite narrow. You know, are there particular cities that created this killer app at a particular moment in time? And I was fascinated by the maps you showed us, talking about electricity in China, electrical appliances in China. But this China is very uneven, right? So we have to pay attention to particular locales and different classes. There's a gradient at which, at that rate, people adopted to new technology, the new appliances. And I think this whole sense of aspiration or the keeping up with the Joneses attitude is most evident in your slide on the telephone, or 讨厌 slide. You know, I have the phone and now I have to share it with people. Obviously, there's an aspiration aspect, and it's not just the angst of having to share this new acquisition with other people. And I'm also fascinated, I guess, based on some of the discussions we had yesterday about translation, Kendall's paper as well. When you're showing the paper of or the diagram of the cow and the light bulb, I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of awkward. I never associate a cow with a light bulb. But then again, we have names that are somewhat like that, like a transformer in Cantonese is 火牛, it's a fire cow. Right, so this cow thing was like horsepower. There is something in there in terms of replacement and the imagination of replacement of some organic form of organically derived forms of energy to electricity or gas, and the different stages at which it comes to be adopted. I think also changes the way we call things. So my wife's family, who I married up, so they adopted this whole thing of refrigerators earlier than I did. So my mother-in-law referred to it as 冰箱, icebox, and to me in Hong Kong is 雪櫃. It's a snow cabinet. That's different ways of conceptualizing it, but then there's also the materiality of it. I'm probably telling you a little bit more about my age than I should, but when I was little, well, the fridge was certainly the prized possession in the living room, along with the TV. You know, they are items that people love to display prominently. And there's a reason it's called a 雪櫃 in my childhood, because you need to defrost that thing, and it's not icy, it's slushy. It is really more snow, ice-like, a white, fluffy coating that you need to just unplug the fridge and remove every now and then. So at different stages of adoption of such technology, appliances, when they reach different levels of maturity and produce different types of materiality, I think that also derives the different ways we translate or recall these things in different locales as well. But the last bit that you talk about is on intellectual property, and I thought I'll spend a moment on that because it seems to be quite a big issue in today's environment. And you used the word transfer, which I think is a little bit generous, because a lot of that is just not quite being mindful of, you know, this is something that you need to pay for under certain regimes. So, you know, depending on whose perspective, transfer is right or not. The flip side of it is how it is guarded, right? How people guard it. And on that, I draw on not my experience just in finance, but I was a semiconductor analyst. I picked semiconductor stocks. And I wonder if that is going to help us, especially in today's environment, to think about the criticalities, the bottlenecks in the food chain. So we talk about TSMC, how we want to control the chip productions there. But then behind TSMC, there is a whole food chain, and TSMC came to be because it basically came up with the recipe that produces semiconductors. And with that, you have equipment from the U.S., from Holland, and also from Japan as well. And hence, you have the emphasis on, well, you cannot ship ASML lithography equipment to places in China. Same with Japan, because Tokyo Electron is a big producer of that. So I wonder if we need to think more by peeling back the layers of these technologies. I don't know what's in the label. I mean, I never studied that. But maybe there's something critical in there. I'm not sure. The tungsten, is the material, is the a particular science, or is actually embodied in a certain equipment that Oppo had to buy. So even though they were producing a lot of light bulbs in China, maybe they were producing it with equipment that they have procured from a foreign source. So I wonder if we need to extend that analysis, not just by thinking who is doing the production of the end product, but also the entire food chain itself, to appreciate how certain IPs came to be appropriated, or that certain parts of the food chain were successful, came to be quite successful in guarding their trade secrets as well. So just some comments, and I hope that, again, would spark off some good discussion with the entire group. So shall we open it to questions and comments?
Thank you. I mean, those are two fantastic presentations and papers and wonderful comments by John. So just a few comments on each. So I learned so much. Just on Billy, on your paper, is there any relationship or any major change? Of course, you end in 1929 when presumably the commercial press is incorporated under either the 1904 or 1919 version of Chinese company law, and then there's a new one that the nationalists put in 1929, which is actually more restrictive, if I remember correctly. I may be wrong, but is there some any change that you see in their organization? And I'd be very interested to figure out how they're governed as a board, and how the board is structured for this. But really, just absolutely fascinating paper. And then for Ghassan, and for your paper, just so many, so interesting. For is this company. So how would you pronounce it in English? Oppo? Yeah. Oppo? Okay. So is it a public company or is it privately held?
It's incorporated. It's a public company.
It's a public company. Okay, I didn't understand. But does Mr. Hu, is he the dominant shareholder? Does he have a shareholding? Is there a shareholding structure that allows for family dominance or his dominance? Does he have a successor who's also a family member, or?
So I don't know whether I should.
No, well, let me go through these. That's sorry. Don't. Anyway, and I'd be very interested to figure out. So what happens to Mr. Hu? He lives till 1981. So I'd be very interested in just in terms of kind of the longer history of this. Second, does the foreign share of the market here presumably goes down over the course of the Nanjing period? We'd be interested to see how much down, or what, but because the market itself at the same time is growing very substantially. And you have, as you showed, you have kind of both national and regional systems of this, and yet very uneven quality, presumably, of electrical devices. I mean, I remember when I was living in Shanghai in the 1980s, when every phone call was dropped, and you couldn't really call from the old French concession to the international settlement to the Chinese city, because you had three different and terrible systems. And anyway, but that's changed now. But it's just some thought of that. As the Kuomintang begins its own state-led manufacturing of this, what's the size of the government share of manufacturing by, say, 1937? By the end of the war, it's going to be much larger. But by 1937, are they growing? Or is it still relatively small and focused on strategic manufacturing, because I know there's a big plant in Nanjing at that time. And then last question, if we were to go up to Shenzhen this afternoon and meet Mr. Ren Zhengfei, what advice would you give him on the basis of this history? Because he was pretty good at re-engineering things also. So thank you. But
the commercial, of course, they were I would say the first, the company law was first sort of enacted in 1904. That was the company code, right? 公司律, right? And then 1914 is ordinance, right? So the 条例, 公司条例. And then 1928 or 29, I can't remember exactly, but the 29, that's a 公司法, right? That's under the 国民党. Actually, each time they change they will combine, because once you register with the government, they first register under the 公司律, and then in 1914 they re-register under the new ordinance, right? And then later on, when the new company law come out, they register again. So actually, they have to follow the law. The law change, they change. So mostly they follow, the major changes they have to follow and re-register. So that's number one answer. But the second time was 1914. Now, we didn't find the Zhang Cheng in the first one. There's 19. Actually, they were incorporated in 1905 and get registered to formally register in the beginning of 1906. So in other words, they submit the document in late 1905. So very close, almost like the law came out, and that was about the time they prepare the document and then get registered. We couldn't find that sort of assembly, what do you call the association, the document. We couldn't find that document. But we have the document of 1914 and then the later one. Now the 1914 one actually was a major change of the ownership of the company, because the first 10 years, as I said, they were set up as a joint venture with half capital from the Japanese Kinkodo shareholders, and then half were the original sort of owner shareholders. So basically, it started as a sort of 50-50, and then they started to invite more shareholders to join in. So the Chinese capital is proportionally getting bigger and bigger. The Japanese one also increased, but couldn't catch up with the Chinese one, right? So by 1914, end of 1913, the Chinese shareholders much more than, in proportion, much more than the Japanese one. So in that year, they make a decision to buy back for the Chinese shareholder. They make a decision, and then they negotiate with the Japanese shareholders, and they purchase all the Japanese share, and turn it into a company solely owned by Chinese shareholders. Before that, actually, it's a multinational sort of share ownership, right? They turned that into a solely. They emphasize on that this is now completely Chinese, no Japanese. Now, of course, the reason behind that is an anti-Japanese movement, and then the competitors, the major competitors, are sort of spreading out a lot of news that commercial press was owned by the Japanese, and now the Japanese are handling our textbooks, and then just sort of polluting our children. So that there's negative ad, right? Negative ad. So that's part of the reason, but there could be other reasons as well. So it's a very complicated story behind that as well. So we have some other publication on that. But what I'm trying to say is the 1929 one, that's very interesting. That is close to the balance sheet. The ownership, they have in the board structure, they have more than 10 directors. Very interesting. They're not really. I mean, they're large shareholder, but some of them are not large shareholders. They're invited to be sitting there. Before that, I can't remember. But before that, for example, Wu Tingfang was a board member. So you can imagine, Wu Tingfang was the one who really advocated, the corporation and the company law. So they have all these kind of people sitting there, and for the 1929, actually one person sitting there is very influential. It's answering to your idea about the change of the company law in 1990 under the Kuomintang. Ma Yin-chu. He was sitting on the board. And he was the one who advocated, not advocate, but I mean he wrote properly, and he was very concerned that the shareholders, the general shareholders, the small shareholders, they control the company policy because they have the majority vote. So they control the company policy and always searching short-term interests, neglecting the long-term interests of the company. So he advocated on that thing. So in other words, he wanted to control actually the small holders, small shareholders, not the large one. So that's very interesting. That's somewhat conscious with the 阶级基本, right? The 三民主义 seems to be kind of conscious of that, but he actually openly writing a criticize, and he was sitting on the board. And in 1929 in Shangwu, I don't want to make it the stories too short. Bear in mind that they have they have the labor union set up from 1925. They already have student union. Actually, they have a branch of the Communist Party. Chen Yun was there. So they have labor strike. They have a lot of tension between the laborers and the and then one other factor about the share ownership is that the Shangwu for about 10 years or so, they give something like sort of shares to the laborers, selected laborers. So this is somewhat like a bonus, right? Share bonus. So they give some shares. So a lot of shareholders are actually their own laborers. So then you can imagine that they cannot control what the people. But those people can be organized. What I'm trying to say, the small shareholders can be organized. They're not divided. They're organized by the union. So when they vote, their votes could be easily sort of override the major shareholders. So that's actually becoming very complicated. And then all the senior managers are very frustrated around that time. No one want to take over, and the CEO was just too old, just pass away. Probably not because of this, but anyway, just too old, pass away, and no one want to pick up the job. So Wang Yunwu was the one that came out and took up the job. And Wang Yunwu he's very very diplomatic, including handling of the union. So he was picked up to take up the job. And then now, I mean, the story is getting longer and longer. but anyway, very, very, very fascinating about the ownership, the relationship between the small shareholders and the larger shareholders, and the board members and so forth. So I think very, very interesting, very interesting, and that affected strategies. That affected how the company is going and so forth. Anyway, sorry, I think I'm speaking too much.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Professor Kirby, very much for your comments and questions. About the shareholders, so I don't have, I really only have, I mean, that's actually one of the few sort of archival files that I've been able to find about this. So in the Academia Sinica, they have had to always sort of at least list, who the shareholders were and so on. So Hu did not necessarily hold a majority, but it's quite clear that, I mean, he was originally from Ningbo, and so a lot of people that he had kinship relations to were, shareholders. And I have not found, for example, I have not really found any evidence that his leadership in the company was ever challenged in the few documents I have about board meetings and so on. So it's quite clear, it seems that he set up the structure in such a way that, and of course we have cases like that. Elizabeth Curl has written about that for Zhang Jian and so on, that he introduced this new corporate structure, but he also knew how to make sure that he kind of remained in control. And in terms of the successor, he did not deem he did not really put in a successor, but maybe that goes into the second question: what happens to Mr. Hu? So he is one of those very patriotic people, quote unquote, that goes actually with the nationalists to Chongqing, and so he moves his he moves part of his. One of the reasons I think why he goes is that one of his factories is actually bombed by the Japanese, and so what is left he moves to Chongqing. But from then on, the story is not really a particularly good one, at least as he later recounts it. So the nationalists, and that's another question you asked. So before 1937, the nationalists don't really get involved too much into like things like light bulbs or electrical consumables, and so. Although, because he stays in the PRC, he later, of course, dislikes the nationalists very much. But actually, from other sources of his that are not written by him, you can see that he had actually quite close relationships with the nationalist government. He had to, and as I said, he did a lot of lobbying to get people to buy his goods and so on. But this changes after 1937. So he goes to Chongqing, and then the nationalists build up electrical appliances factories there, particularly light bulbs, and they just have more means. They of course the war constrains what they have, but compared to a private entrepreneur, they could invest more, and they take away some of his stuff, and he's quite bitter about that. And so to that added then is kind of the war economy, hyperinflation, and so he is one of those people that he stays in the PRC, but his company is actually still around. It's called Zhongguo Yaming Dengpo or something like that, but it's still around today. But it's typical Gongsihe case. He hands it over in the end, and I'm sort of trying to look into that now. It's a bit difficult because one of the main sources I have is he spent a lot of time writing his memoirs and so on, but of course they're very positive. Nothing about the anti-rightist movement or anything like that, so it's a bit difficult. But he basically stayed in the PRC and seems to have still been involved somewhat in the management of the company. But for me, he's sort of a typical case of someone who was just exhausted very much after the war. He seems to have been just having gone through too much. First, the nationalists start to compete with him in Chongqing, and then he has to go through inflation, and then he has to somehow try to get his stuff back to Shanghai after the war, and then the civil war is obviously breaking out, and he just seems to be, and his business also just doesn't seem to work anymore after 1937. I think, I've already answered about the nationalist government. I think they really only become important in terms of electrical consumables after the war breaks out. Before then, some preparations are being made, but from what I found, they are not really. Before the war, it's really just things like wireless that is really militarily, particularly strategically important that they really get involved in. In terms of the market share, so it's not that the Chinese manufacturers take over the whole market, but it's simply the case that in 1920. General Electric, I should say, and a few other foreign manufacturers completely dominate the market, and by 1937, around 50% of the market is supplied by Chinese manufacturers, which is and the foreign competitors try a lot. They form a whole conglomerate. They kind of try to cut their cost of sales network and things like that, but they are just not able to win back the market share. I think it's because at least at the top level, the Chinese manufacturers are able to compete in terms of quality but undercut in price, and that's just something the foreign manufacturers can't really deal with in terms of winning back the market share that they lose. Finally, about Ren Zhengfei, I'm not quite sure. As a historian, I'm not quite sure what I should offer, but I think, of course, first of all, the situations are rather different, of course, because I think, again, one of the advantages I think Chinese entrepreneurs had in the Republic period was just there was this global flow of information and technology. Talking about, John, what you asked, yes, he bought a lot of foreign machinery from Japan, from Germany. He actually, that's where the German-sounding name of his company actually comes from. He buys up a small German light bulb manufacturer in the early 1920s in Shanghai, and that's where he gets a lot of his starting of his machinery, and I think that today, of course, is not quite as easy anymore. The other thing I would say is that be a bit careful in terms of how reliant you become on the government necessarily as a private entrepreneur. I don't want to get into the shareholding structure of Huawei. That's a whole different story. But in general, I think in Hu's case, that doesn't turn out, first close relations, but then later they become a competitor and kind of push him out of the market. So, be aware of the relying too much on the government, I would say. Yeah.
That's going to get reported tomorrow. So, I think Guoqi has a question. Why don't we collect a few questions and then we can see how much time we have. Go to you first.
So just questions, no comments. Okay, but I do have a short comment. But two brilliant presentations, by the way. I do enjoy a lot, learn a lot. Also, your masterful comments as well. Very short comment for Ghassan, because you talk about electricity and telephone. When I was a kid, I don't know Ziwu's situation. My village did not have electricity until 1993. Then just in 2003, when I helped my parents to set up a telephone line, that's a major issue. You talk about the cartoons there, so 讨厌, right? Gosh, my parents then later on say I brought trouble to them because every village came to my household for the telephone, to use a telephone. In China, by the way, at that time, nothing to do with the money or connection. It's a rank based. You have to be on certain rank. So I don't know. You ended with the early 30s. So now return to the question. So Ghassan, you ended with a copyright and patents, right? So you made the argument say the Chinese engineers pretty much follow the practice to basically to carry out the patents and copyright. So I don't know how they did, but also that return to the Billy's presentation. Commercial press at that time in early 20th century has a lot of copyright issues, dispute with American publishers. I'm pretty sure maybe something to do with Macmillan too. So that basically, of course, they have a lot of arguments. Some is legal, sometimes it's a so-called national interest argument to education, right? So I don't know how you're going to respond to this. So should I?
Let's collect a few more questions.
Okay. Well, great presentations. Very interesting work. So let me just ask two quick questions or comments. First, for Billy's part, as an economist, I would say, just showing us the financial numbers. Yeah, seeing the financial numbers themselves, especially for non-historians, they seem to be like, okay, yeah, we know the numbers, how to read them. What do we get out of them? What are the takeaways, right? For example, I thought when you pointed out the goodwill charge or valuation of 5 million for Macmillan versus no goodwill items for the commercial press, I thought that could be a very good entry point to really talk about the legal, the context the difference in the legal context between the two countries, because even today in China, for as far as the CSRC is concerned, as well as the new company law, security law on the mainland, they're very, very particular about any number, any valuation to be given to to intangible assets like reputation or goodwill. No allowance for that. Even if you could put some numbers for certain industries, or they have very strict restrictions. But I think for the most part, this is a reflection of the trust environment, as well as the legal reliability in terms of protection and enforcement for intellectual property and intangible assets. Anyway, this is like one possible entry point to offer more insights in addition to just showing the numbers, right? I think for Ghassan, it's very interesting. Actually, about 10 years ago, I spent some time on the history of marketing in China, how that came into existence. I mean, when I was, I did not collect as much or as many pictures as you did, but I focused on Coca-Cola, how they were doing it in the 1920s and 1930s. they relied on like 月份牌, like the calendar, catalogs, and so on. It's actually pretty interesting, but I think you have much more, especially like the cow. But I think when John made the comments, John, he grew up in a big city like Hong Kong, so he does not really totally appreciate what a cow means to the Chinese people, because for the farmers, the cow is a major, the most treasured asset for the whole farming production. So that's why, given that cultural background, if you want to get people's attention in this peasant society, well, the cow is one way to go anyway. But I think they did a lot of creativity in coming up with that. So, but I think for the larger picture of your work, I would view that as really China's modernization in action, right? Because in the late 19th century, when we talk about the introduction of the modern corporation and so on, to most people, that's still so abstract. Only people like Professor So would be interested. I mean, I'm interested in that very much. So very much interested in that topic. But for others, then the electrical industry, especially we're talking about the second industrial revolution. So it has a lot of significant impact, as you showed, on people's lives and production and so on. So the bigger picture I would bring in is, the modernization movement that was started in the 1960s, especially the 1860s and then the 1870s. But this is a very, not just a continuation of that process, but also really in action affecting a very broad spectrum of the population in terms of their daily lives and so on. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I also enjoyed the panel very much. Great papers, great comments, and learned a lot. I have a short question for Billy. You showed us that the commercial press had a very dispersed stockholders were very dispersed. But then you concluded that it's a quasi-family or quasi-family business. And I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. I mean, a family business is when it's founded by a family, it's in the ownership of the family, and then important management positions are filled by the family. But what does quasi-family mean? Does it mean 2 or 3 families, or is it just an allegory? Thank you.
And one last question there.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation very much as well. I would like to ask a couple of questions, Professor. So the first one is, from the finance perspective, we look at the balance sheet, we look at the P&L income statement, as well as the cash flow. We talk about the business strategies, talk about the differences between these two amazing bookstores. My question is, now we are in 2023, looking back now, are their strategies really successful? You talk about leadership. I would like to ask, from the West, obviously from New York, it's a Western leadership style. In the East, commercial press is a Oriental, it's an Eastern leadership style. Could you comment a little bit, what are the differences between these two, from these two perspectives? For Ghassan, thank you very much. Fascinating to able to understand, learn more about the E&E. My question is, based on your research so far, do you find Chinese also carry a good attribute in terms of innovation? We are creative, we are innovative. If not, what we can do differently so that we can nurture this kind of attributes? Thank you.
Great. Well, in the interest of time, maybe I'll ask each of the speakers to respond briefly. Well, if you don't mind, can we have the exchange?
Okay. so briefly to Professor Xu about patents. I mean, I think my point was, again, and I'm not trying to make sort of an argument about, necessarily should you have, and I should also say patents are somewhat different from copyright, of course. Copyright was quite a bit more developed at that time than patents, patent system. I think what I'm engaging with is sort of there's a literature that tries to see whether do you need a functioning patent system in order to have industrialized, basically. And I think the general sense has been that yes, you do. But for Europe, there are also studies that show the opposite. For example, Switzerland didn't have a patent system. Netherlands didn't have a patent system for quite a while in the 19th century and still managed to industrialize. And I think I'm just trying to show in the Chinese case that in terms of making use of all these global flows of technology and so on, not having a patent system wasn't exactly detrimental. It was quite helpful. And the Japanese case is quite instructive because there it doesn't work because they introduce the Western legal system and then the Western companies can take advantage of that. Yeah, thank you, Joe, for the comments on I think advertising and of course I think I need to kind of frame this very much in terms of second industrial revolution in China and how this all comes through. I think in terms of advertising, this was of course just like what I showed with the cow and all this whole idea of like doing marketing through telling people what electrical appliances are actually about is only one aspect. So they also did other kinds like calendars and other general newspaper advertisements. They did that too, and that will be part of what I look at as well, of course. Yeah. I think just very briefly, I think at this point in terms of innovation, what we clearly see is that innovation happens mainly in terms of adaptation. So in a sense of using the foreign technology, but then just one example, the voltages, because of all the different concessions and so on, and the electricity standards are very different in different parts of China. And that was something that where the if you manufacture light bulbs, you had to kind of adapt the foreign technology so that it can better deal with this. Probably I shouldn't go into too much detail now, but I think in terms of adaptation, that's why I see innovation at this point, particularly on the Chinese side. So it's clearly not just straight away copying or anything like that. I think there's, and that's also not what I'm implying. I'm saying, there's a lot of innovation and adaptation going on clearly on the Chinese side as well.
Professor Xu's, really point out one of the major sort of copyright conflict. Well, it's really the legal case of commercial patch and I can't remember what's the name of that American company. Never mind. But actually, it's not only one. But actually, it's like a few ones. But also commercial press versus Japanese company and so forth. So there are quite a few cases. We have another sort of articles. I can send you a book chapter about the book industry's what do you call it, arbitration. Arbitration was a new thing. 公断, so it's a new thing. It's import, transplanted from the West. So then become, there are some cases were handled by the litigation, some handled by arbitration, and then other things were handled by mediation. So there are 3 types. So we have some cases on that, and so forth. I'll let you know. But major case, major impact. I think Professor Chen's really is this is a brilliant thing. I think you remind me that this issue of trust that also define how the people are doing the goodwill in particular in accounting and so forth. We'll explore more of that actually. So the quasi-family, when I say quasi-family, I don't mean that they are a few company put together or one company. So in the Macmillan Press actually is very clear. The major shareholders were family. They're family members, right? The three cousins of the second generation of the Macmillan family. But in commercial press, the major player, including shareholders, the managers, CEO, not all of them, some of them, but not all of them were family members. They're friends, right? Or maybe a remote cousin or something. But basically, they cannot be defined as family members. In particular, when they move down to, in the very beginning, they might have some kind of a closer relationship, but then after the cooperation with the Japanese, joint venture with the Japanese, and then 20 years down the road, then actually I don't think we can define it as family business at all, because I mean, all these major players in the companies, they have no family relationship. So that's number one. But why I'm still saying that it's quasi-family, because quasi-family is not family. If the family is family, it's not quasi-family. Quasi-family is somewhat like a family, but it's not a family, right? That's why we say quasi. So quasi means fussy, it's a very fussy family relationship. So, but why I'm still using that term, actually it's very risky to apply a term like this to describe the relationship, because I think they're very close. And they always feel that they belong to us. In a sense, it's China's family. In this company, we're in one family. So I don't know whether it's common in, let's say if you are in General Motors, are you going to say that we're in one family? Probably people don't say that, but I have a feeling that the people working for Shangwu, they have a pride. There are a lot of infighting. But the umbrella, the commercial press itself seems to be a family. We all belong to this family. And we have a lot of infighting, just like any family business. As brothers are fighting, sister, brother. Later on, sister as well. Earlier, it was only brothers. But then later on, sister, brothers, all siblings are fighting. But then, so under the family, it's okay that you have infighting. But somehow there's some kind of identity. I think maybe I use the word identity. So they all identify themselves as 我是商务人 商务 or just like Hong Kong,我们是港大人 So it's somewhat like a family sense, but not really family. That kind of sense actually is identity, and all sense of identity, if it's very strong, impact on people's behavior, impact on people's judgment and taste and so forth. So I think this is what I meant. But I think I have to explore a little bit more on that. Actually, that quasi-family term did not appear in our paper. Only when I was preparing the PPT, I found it more fancy.
Corporation is an anti-traditional creation, and you want to bring it back to the family again to make it sound more traditional. Anyway.
Sorry, all right. Well,
Could be.
We can be talking about these two projects a whole day. I mean, we can actually have a workshop on each of them. And they're only presenting a little bit of the larger projects to us. So I'm sure the books that will come out of it, the research output that will come out of these two projects will find a ready audience. So thank you very much to both our presenters and your enthusiastic participation.